All right. Well, good morning and welcome to the final day of Arizona's Virtual Roads and Streets Conference. I am Carla Petty, FHWA Arizona Division Administrator. And as you all know, transportation infrastructure is critical to our economy and to our quality of life. And financing tools are very helpful to advancing transportation projects. And I am so pleased to moderate this session this morning on financing projects through the Build America Bureau. We have two speakers, and I'm going to introduce them first, and then we will get started. First, we have Carl Ringgold. Carl is a project development lead with US DOT's Build America Bureau. Carl has been with US DOT for over 6 years, serving as Secretary Fox's scheduling and advance team, and in working in various roles in the Federal Transit Administration, including the Office of Civil Rights, Office of Safety and Oversight, and the Office of Program Management. Prior to joining USDOT, Carl worked for the Maryland Transit Administration and taught world history to 9th graders in Atlanta, Georgia through Teach for America. Carl is a Phi Beta Kappa summa cum laude graduate of Morehouse College. And our second presenter today is Dave Wessel. Dave is the planning manager for MetroPlan, the Metropolitan Planning Organization for Flagstaff. Dave's 23 year at MetroPlan includes 2 successful multimodal transportation tax campaigns and several regional transportation plans. His good fortune there includes partnering with local agencies to see the advent of transit, advanced traffic management systems, and a significant expansion of the urban trail system. Through MPO planning efforts, David has assisted local agencies in developing plans and policies for activity centers, strong urban design, and standards for pedestrian-friendly streets. David has a master's degree in community planning from the University of Maryland. Oh, we've got Maryland connections here. Developed several comprehensive plans for communities in Bangkok County, Idaho, and served as the Navajo County planner and park planner longer ago than he cares to admit. So at this time, I will turn it over to Carl to provide us with an overview of the Build America Bureau. Carl, it's all yours.
Thank you, Carla. Thank you, Dave. And hello, everyone, virtually from wherever you are in the country. It's good to be here today. Happy to be speaking with you all about the Build America Bureau. So the Build America Bureau, Reimagining Innovative Finance and Procurement for the Future is sort of our catch line. Just give me 1 second, sorry. Okay. Our mission, the Build America Bureau serves as a single point of contact and coordination for states, municipalities, and other project sponsors who are looking to expand the use of federal transportation credit programs such as TIFIA and Riff, innovate, right? Find new approaches to project financing and delivery, as well as deliver, right? Streamline technical and financial assistance. And for those of you who have not heard of the Bureau, it's probably because we are the newest, if not one of the newest offices within US DOT. Was sort of the brainchild of Secretary Fox as he was leaving. And Secretary Chow sort of took this on as one of her first initiatives to actually establish us as an office. And so historically, TIFIA was administered by the Federal Highway Administration, Riff by FRA, and now both of those programs, as well as the PABs, the private activity bonds, are housed in the Build America Bureau. So one of our first programs, TIFIA, the Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act of 1998. And like I said, historically, this program had been administered by the Federal Highway Administration. What does TIFIA offer? Long-term repayment period of up to 35 years, really 40 years since that repayment period can be deferred 4 or 5 years. There's no prepayment penalty. TIFIA has the option to finance up to 33% of eligible project costs. You have the option to draw funds as needed, and you only pay interest on drawn funds. So, let's say, for example, you take out a $10 million loan, but that $10 million loan, you really only need to use $1 million of it in the first year. You're only going to accrue interest on the amount of money that you've drawn down, not the full loan amount. It's highly customizable to meet borrower needs. We literally work with the borrower on a case-by-case basis to see what your project is, how it looks, what your needs are, all of those things, and we tailor that project and that loan package to whatever your project needs are. We also offer loan guarantees and lines of credit. And as you can see, the low interest rate as of 9/11/20 was 1.42% for a 35-year loan. Now, a subsidy of TIFIA is the TIFIA Rural Project Initiative. So all of the same things I just mentioned still apply. The difference being is that TIFIA RPI applies to cities, towns, jurisdictions outside of a census-defined urbanized area with a population greater than 150,000. And I promise I will elaborate on that more. RPI can finance up to 49% of eligible project costs versus the 33% with TIFIA. It's a fixed rate of half the US Treasury rate. So if you were to close a TIFIA loan, a TIFIA RPI loan as of 9/11, that interest rate would be 0.72%. And we have some optimism, at least for the next few years, that these interest rates will stay relatively low based on what the Fed announced. And TIFIA RPI also covers all borrower fees. And so when you're going through this process, there is a procurement process by which legal advisors and financial advisors are onboarded. And typically, the cost of doing that can range in the hundreds of thousands of dollars for a regular TIFIA loan. For RPI, the government covers all of those fees. And then I have just some statistics here that, I'm sure all of us on this call knows, but I still think it's worth noting that approximately 40% of county roads are inadequate for travel, and there are 38,000 rural bridges that are in poor condition. Our next program, Riff, the Railroad Rehabilitation and Improvement Act. And like I said, historically, whereas TIFIA was administered by FHWA, Riff was administered by FRA. Very similar to TIFIA in terms of long-term fixed interest, flexible payments, no prepayment penalties, all of those things. One of the key differences is that Riff can finance up to 100% of eligible project costs. So whereas TIFIA can only finance 33%, TIFIA RPI can only finance 49%. And both of those TIFIA programs have a 80% cap when you talk about total federal assistance. So the federal government can only give you a total of 80% of those project costs if they're grants or other sort of financing involved, government financing involved. There's an 80% cap there. With Riff, it's 100%. And the credit risk premium that I mentioned earlier, all of those fees associated with the TIFIA loan is offset using upfront payments by the borrowers, collateral, and adjustment to the interest rate. So what you typically see here as it relates to collateral is a rail line using, some of their facilities or some of their, rail infrastructure as collateral. So similar to TIFIA RPI being a subsidy of TIFIA, Riff Express is a subsidy of Riff, all right? Can finance up to 100% of eligible project costs up to $50 million. And the eligible borrowers received expedited processing, up to 5% of CRP cost assistance, up to $100,000 in fee assistance, and please forgive my typo. And this program was started just this year. The administration noticed that the volume of Riff application for Riff applications that were coming in for class 2 and 3 railroads was zero. We weren't getting any, right? There was just no incentive for a lot of class 2 and class 3 railroads to come through this program. I think it had been 6 or 7 years before between applications before this program. And it was really an incentive to see more class 2 and class 3 railroads applying for some of these programs that we have. Another program, PABs, the private activity bonds. It's authorized to allocate up to $15 billion in PABs. It's State or local governments issue tax-exempt bonds on behalf of a private entity, and that private entity or developer is responsible for all debt service. This is no different than bonding at market level. It's the same exact process. Typically we see borrowers who are already going through perhaps a grant program or one of our other financing programs that I mentioned consider bonds, since they're already coming and doing business with us. My presentation is typically short and sweet. You see my email there, carlringgold@dot.gov. If you have a project that comes to mind that you would like to talk about, I am always here to talk. But before I end, I would just like to highlight a few projects that come to mind as it relates to some of our programs. We recently, and by we I mean the U.S. Department of Transportation and the Build America Bureau, we recently closed our first RPI loan. And this is a very big deal because it is our first RPI loan. This was an inception of one administration that was carried into a different administration, and the synergy has been great. That loan was for $13 million for a operations and maintenance facility in San Luis Obispo, California. Coming from FTA, I worked in our rural transportation office, and so I have an affinity for not just transit, but rural transit in particular. And we all have read about what California is doing with, trying to turn pretty much the whole state into an electric state as it relates to buying electric vehicles and things like that. And so you're seeing a lot of transit agencies, particularly rural transit agencies, try and get ahead of that curve. They're turning what were, historically outdoor maintenance and operations facilities into indoor maintenance and operations facilities that have the capacity to, maintain solar power and have charging stations and things like that. And so this was one of the first loans along that line period that the department has given, and it was our first RPI loan. And now for regular TIFIA, there was a $99.6 million loan to the city of Bellevue, Washington for the Bell Red Street Network project. All right, and this was a combination of 12 multimodal roadways planned to support the new Bell Red neighborhood in the northern part of the city. And there are a plethora of projects that we have. If you have a project in mind and perhaps you want a point of reference, you want to read something that, reminds you of your project, please reach out to me. There's almost certainly something I can share. I'll pause here if there are any questions, Carla. If not, I will clarify just a few more things, but I do want to give folks the opportunity to ask questions if they may have them.
So, Carl, one of the questions are, can you explain what the definition of rural is? That's not an easy word for me to say, but the definition of rural.
Yes. So this is something I've not struggled with, but that's a question I ask often. There is no singular definition for rural, even within the Department of Transportation. The way FTA defines rural is different than the way I know FHWA defines rural. But for the purposes of the Rural Projects Initiative, the TIFIA Rural Projects Initiative, a rural project is one that is located outside of an urbanized area with a population greater than 150,000 individuals. And so if the Census Bureau defines an area as a urbanized area, that population exceeds 150,000 people, that area cannot be deemed rural, okay? You have to be outside of that urbanized area that exceeds 150,000 people. And I know that is a loopy answer, but that is literally what we operate on. We operate on exactly how the Census Bureau defines it.
Okay, well, thank you, Carl. And, I think at this time we'll move to our next presenter, and then we'll come back with both Carl and David if there's any questions. I'd also like to remind the audience at this time that if you do have any questions, please put them in your chat pod there at the bottom of your screen. You should be able to find that. Put those chat questions in there and we will be able to ask them of our presenters. So with that, Dave, if you want to share your screen and pull up your presentation, we will move on to Dave. And as you listen to Dave's presentation, I think you'll hear a little bit about that rural and urban question that we had, because Dave is with Flagstaff MPO, which makes us think of urban, but I believe his project did qualify as a rural project. So with that, I will now kick it over to Dave. So go ahead, Dave. And you need to unmute, Dave, please.
Yeah, just want to confirm that you can see my screen.
We can.
Excellent. So again, thank you, Carla. And we went in search of federal financing. As Carla mentioned, my name is David Wessel, Planning Manager for MetroPlan here in Flagstaff, Arizona. And we search for solutions for our members' transportation problems. And we do that through leveraging cooperation to maximize financial and political resources to build out our transportation system. So the people that we work with, the agencies, are the City of Flagstaff, Coconino County, Northern Arizona University, Mountain Line, our regional transit agency, and the Arizona Department of Transportation. Just a quick look at our region, about 525 square miles surrounding Flagstaff here in north central Arizona. We have about 90,000 people in the region. Local government, NAU are our major employers. This really all started with what I call this kind of mythical destination, looking for that magic elixir that would bring a collection of projects together in the downtown. That diamond you see up here is City Hall. This is the north end of NAU, and then this is the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad. Well, all these squiggly lines, this is a big railroad overpass. This line here is a major flood control project. We have a $20 million transit connection center coming in place. An old bridge that doesn't meet standards. It's a railroad bridge, another pedestrian undercrossing, all within less than a mile. And we were looking for really a technical solution because there's lots of grades and right-of-way issues. So we're looking for help. But it's kind of a challenge when you have all of these different agencies involved. The Railroad Administration, FTA, FHWA, U.S. Army Corps, ADOT, BNSF. And we're really looking for something to pull that together. Well, not surprisingly, it was another swamp of alphabet soup where we found our solution. Started with an Everyday Count, EDC program that talked about the Economic Development Agency's a program. I called them and they said, nah, not quite the right fit. And they sent me over to the Build America Bureau, which is what I want to talk to about mostly today. But even as we were describing this to the Build America Bureau in this collection of projects, and they were excited about it, Burlington Northern, the Army Corps, and the city got together and decided to tunnel underneath the railroad instead of requiring this shoe fly that tied all these projects together. And so that larger collective effort disappeared. But as we all know, we're in transportation. We have many problems. And so there's many paths that we can take to solve those. And as I had made my presentation to the Bureau, they introduced me to and our member agencies to TIFIA and Riff, and we're very intrigued and had interest on a number of fronts. So back in November 2018, the city had voters had passed Propositions 419 and 420. 419 covered a range of transportation projects, including pedestrian bicycle projects. Many of these ranged from $5 to $20 million. And then 420 was dedicated to the Lone Tree Railroad overpass, a new project just east of downtown Flagstaff. So those all looked interesting. The Rio to Flag flood control project was close to $100 million project, and the city was looking at financing their share. And because of its proximity to the railroad and influence there, there was some possibilities for a Riff loan. And then, as I mentioned, there's this $20 million downtown connection center. And Mountain Line was looking at making that a mixed-use development, possibly with some housing, possibly with some commercial space. And so there's going to be these private revenue streams. And so the ability to pull all that together under one of these loan programs was very interesting to us. But we saw this fraught with dangers and dilemmas. When you take on one of these loans, you federalize the project. And at least for 419 and 420 propositions, those are all local tax dollars. You know, the costs had been estimated and the funding was adequate. And so what was this going to do to those projects in terms of time delay, procurement and project delivery, and the extra cost, because federalization does come with cost. And there's also a number of questions that went with that as well, in terms of how do you sequence all the financing and NEPA design and construction questions. Who's going to manage the project? Is it going to be ADOT or the city? Would ADOT or FHWA manage NEPA? These were all questions that we had there at the beginning. So MetroPlan really kind of served as the travel agent in this sense, because we know that the TIP, the Transportation Improvement Program, is your ticket to getting a federal project done. And so we worked with the client, the City of Flagstaff, through their community development and engineering departments. We worked with the grant manager, and importantly, we worked with finance. And you can see I've got that an exclamation point as a translator there. Because our in-country guide, the Build America Bureau, they're very good, and they have modal experts to talk highway, talk freight, talk rail, if you need to. But they also speak a lot of financial language, which for many of us is a bit foreign. So having somebody to translate for us was very good. And then turns out that the FHWA Arizona division, run there by Carla Petty, our moderator today, they were going to do the heavy lifting. So they're the Sherpas. They were going to do some of that project management with the and handling NEPA. So there's our team. And to get started, we really needed to map things out. And so to keep our map simple, we chose that Lone Tree Overpass. It had a singular funding source. It was a large project, so it had about $74 million. So it has a lot of potential for savings on interest when you're looking at financing that much. And we jumped into educational sessions with the Bureau and some serious discussions with the division there in Arizona about NEPA and project management. It turned out to be really useful in helping us understand the process. And we learned about milestones that we would need to hit. You have to have a $10 million minimum project size. You have to have a secure revenue stream, which we felt we were confident of. Eventually, you're going to sign a letter of intent. There's going to be initiation fees, but turns out we did qualify for the Rural Project Initiative, so those would be waived. Our urbanized area is probably about 73,000 in size, so well below that 150,000 threshold. We're going to have to get NEPA in your final design before we could close the loan. So that was really important to work out the schedule, and that we would be subject to a credit check to set that final rate. So as we kind of learn more about the map and the direction we're heading, we really needed, to provide these answers, these provisions, as I have it called here. And so we looked to put together this integrated schedule and do environmental screening, investigate alternative project delivery, research federal project costs, and do our homework on finances and look at financial scenarios. So the questions, can we get there on time? Well, yes, we can. The city had, in the tax campaign, said we can deliver this overpass by November 2026. And so they really were committed to standing by that promise and wanted to be assured that this type of process would not slow it down. So we put together this color-coded kind of Gantt chart that integrated the finance, the NEPA program, and the design build program. And got a lot of assistance from from the city, from the Bureau, and from the division to make sure the time frames and sequences were laid out. And we were confident, and I think we convinced the city that, yeah, we could hit this mark. Would the NEPA jungle eat us for lunch? NEPA can be scary at times. It doesn't necessarily have to be, but I think people get a little worried about it. And we discovered that no, this is really not necessarily a problem. And we determined that by doing an environmental screening, a pretty thorough one, of all the 419 and 420 projects. And you can see those listed here on the left side. We looked at categorical exclusion, that lowest level of NEPA. We looked at the disqualifications. We looked at the categories for CEs and to see if these projects would fit. And then you can see all the different resource areas: biological, cultural, air quality, noise. And we worked with local experts to really investigate those and see where we stood, or where we thought we stood on NEPA, and rated those high, medium, and low after kind of crunching some numbers and assessing situations. And then came back to the division with what we thought were our desired levels, or we thought were defensible levels of NEPA clearance. And you can see those again, whether they're EA or CE. We really didn't see any that rose to the level of an EIS. And we also saw some, like the top two that are color coded there on Lone Tree, that we could actually combine to maybe get some efficiencies. And then a couple others that we thought we could combine under the CE process. And so the division couldn't guarantee that this is what the process would lend, but they felt that we had done our due diligence and that was reasonable, at least to move forward with this level of expectation. Again, not a full promise. And I think the city was relatively comfortable. Again, we factored those into that integrated schedule. So can we run things our own way? Yes, we can. In fact, the Bureau and the DOT has really been a leader in trying to mainstream alternative project delivery methods. And there's an FHW website that I have a screenshot of here, and you can see down in the bottom right of that, alternative project delivery. Well, design build is one of them, and what the city wanted to go with was a progressive design build, which from a NEPA perspective is a little more aggressive, and but has been done. And so the Bureau confirmed that they could handle this, but it hasn't been done often. So there's a little bit of risk there, but I think the city was pleased that they could still do that. And the other thing that we learned in this process, that the city, through this loan project, our program, would be the direct recipient. And that's true for not only this loan program, but several grants like build grants. And that means the city would be in control, that there would be support directly for their project managers, and that communication would be simplified. ADOT does a fine job of managing projects, but when they're managing a local project, there's an extra layer of communication that can complicate things at times. And so the city was pleased that they could be a direct recipient here. So what's the real cost of federalization? Well, maybe it's more than you think. We spent some time online looking into this and thought it would be about 22%, which was at least not refuted by the Bureau as we talked with them about that. We found research that said it could be as high as 50%. And at least in my personal experience talking with colleagues and feedback at conferences and stuff, I often hear 30 to 40%. So 22% was relatively lenient. So now we get down to it, does it make sense? Does it make dollars and cents? Well, we looked at interest rate spreads and federal cost assumptions through some of these scenarios, and it turns out to be that it's not so much in our case. And maybe during the Q&A we can talk about when does it make sense. But we found that the increased federalization costs exceeded the interest savings. So, we did the math, and here we have the $74 million project, but we know that some of the design work, right-of-way, NEPA costs are going to be cash flowed, so it's going to reduce the amount that we have to finance. So we looked at that and we inflated it here it's by 21% versus the 22. And then you can see the rate. We're thinking about 4%. The city actually is getting better rates than that right now, but maybe with COVID and other things, it might go up. And then the rate at one time was actually 0.5% under the RPI. Our term here is only 15 years because that's how much time would be left on the tax in terms of being able to pay this thing back. So we couldn't really exercise that full 35, 40 years to do this. Did the math, and our savings would be about $375,000. We did a little sensitivity test to say, hey, if we could get our federal costs down to only 15%, what could we save? Wow, now it's like $5 million, and that was pretty exciting, except, from a risk perspective, we thought chances are federalization costs are going to be more than that 21% as opposed to less, and that rate gap is actually going to be smaller. This was kind of a maximum rate gap that we could imagine. So from a risk perspective, we thought breaking even was probably about as good as we could do. So what did we learn along the way as we prepared for this journey that ultimately the city decided not to embark on? Well, that BAB is a pretty good guide. Bring a good translator, but they're very helpful, really good to work with, help you understand the program. Go big or stay home. You really need to fit that BAB project profile. And even though we had a $74 million project, which for us is big, and you heard the San Luis Obispo project is $13 million in that work, it really needs to fit the full profile. Something that maybe we can learn more about. Do your financial homework. Sometimes it makes sense. In our case, we felt like it didn't. And then be sensitive to your client's needs. It was very important to them to have control, to save money, to not delay the project. And we wanted to give them some assurance that those things could be achieved. So at this point, be happy to take any questions and look forward to discussing this more with you all.
So, Dave, this is Carla. Thank you for sharing your experience. And as you said, you ended up not going that route, but we really appreciate you helping us understand what you went through. The city looks like they did an extreme amount of due diligence to determine whether going for a Build America Bureau, a RIP financing would be appropriate. So, Carl, with that, could you offer any insights? I mean, do we have any data on the number of successful projects or any thoughts on Dave's experience along the way? I know the Arizona division is ready and willing to help be that facilitator, that not necessarily the translator, but the go-between between our recipients here in Arizona and the Build America Bureau. I don't know if that's what you typically see or if it's just direct recipients coming directly to the Bureau. So if you could just touch on that a little bit about how do you get something started?
Yeah, absolutely. And David, thank you for sharing that. It actually had me sitting here thinking about a lot of the things that I've sort of learned. So I come from a world of grants, right? Prior to this job, I come from a world of funding and, financing as it relates to transportation infrastructure, I think it's a very new thing outside of how it's traditionally looked with highway projects. We have an underwriter and he always eloquently says this, our job is not to function as a government loan office. Our job is not to make money, right? Our job is to see that infrastructure is built. So whether that, infrastructure is built through doing business with us or whether that infrastructure is built through doing business elsewhere, so long as it's built, we're happy. What I'll say is this. Yes, federalizing a project can be very expensive. However, the pitch that I always sort of give is everyone typically applies for funding. There are a plethora of grant programs around the Department of Transportation. And in order to qualify for any of those grant programs, the project essentially has to be federalized. So NEPA has to be done and all of those things. So what we typically see, the sponsors who typically do business with us are sponsors who are also applying to a grant program. It's not to say that they'll be successful in applying to that grant program, but the project itself has already been federalized as a means of applying to that discretionary grant program. That's what we typically see. And we've had sponsors engage us in the past, and similar to David's, presentation, they evaluate everything. There's a project that, is already conceived or is being conceived, but is not necessarily looking to get any sort of funding from a discretionary grant program, but they are looking for financing. And the cost of federalizing the project just isn't worth it. All right. That's happened before. It's also happened, conversely, where perhaps there's a project that is not looking for funding at all, that finds that financing with us exclusively works for them. So it is truly taken on a case-by-case basis. But, we're never unhappy if someone doesn't come do business with us. We're always happy if, in the end, that infrastructure is built by some means or another. And so I actually appreciate David touching on that because, again, we're still a loan office. It's still financing. The money still has to be paid back. The project still has to be federalized. There's still a lot of requirements that may somewhat serve as a barrier. We're always here to, work toward yes, as my executive director always says. But, if someone doesn't do business with us, we are not upset about it. And we recognize that federalizing a project can be expensive. But again, what we typically see is most of our sponsors have applied to one of the department's discretionary grant programs, whether they were successful or not. And in doing that, they've federalized the project.
Yeah, if I could respond to that, Carl, thank you for that information. And yeah, and that was our experience. No hard feelings. Just like we're going to walk you through the process and you reach your decision. That was great. But you do raise a couple good points about, yeah, a lot of times you're going to combine this with a grant. You're federalizing the project anyway, and that's a good thing. And sometimes there's going to be a wider interest rate gap depending on who's applying, and that can make a huge difference in terms of whether this works. One of the things I noticed, we were looking at applying for the technology deployment grant, and one of the challenges, and we had in that 419 some federal some funding that could apply to that type of implementation, but it was really going to be spread out over several years. So let's advance it. Hey, it's going to be a federal project. Let's look at TIFIA. And one of the things that I found, and maybe you can speak to, because I don't know that I ever got a real solid answer, but that by virtue of using federal financing, that gets put onto the federal share.
Yes.
And so it's like, now we can't meet our 50% match in that particular grant program because all of our local dollars that we're going to use to pay off the financing gets shifted to the federal share. And to me, that didn't make any sense. And I'm wondering, it sounds, you're shaking your head. Yeah. So it's like, that's the way it works. So I got the right information. It just, boy, there seems like an opportunity here to kind of tweak that and really help take advantage of this program in a meaningful way.
What I can say as a federal employee is that I cannot lobby, right? But I mean, this is one of those things that it's in statute. It's the law that we have to follow, and that's how it works. Again, when I was leaving FTA, this world of funding, come over to the Build America Bureau, this world of finance. I mean, that is one of the questions that I harped on, and that there is no real answer to why it works that way. It is just, it's how it works, right? And until that law changes, it's how it works. Before I got this job, I never paid attention to most of this stuff. I got this job and I saw these NEPA commercials coming on TV, right? And I was super encouraged by changes to NEPA, right? Because NEPA somewhat serves as a barrier to people and sponsors doing business with us because of how drawn out that process is and how expensive it can be, right? So there's some streamlining changes coming for NEPA. But in terms of TIFIA's 80% cap in total federal assistance, yes, even a loan from the federal government is deemed to be federal assistance. And so a loan in conjunction with a grant cannot exceed 80%. And I ask myself, well, if it's a loan and I'm borrowing that money, I have to pay that money back. Why should that impact other grant money that I could potentially get? I mean, that's a valid question. I think that is a question for Congress, and I'm not being facetious in saying that. It is the constraint of the TIFIA statute that we have to work in right now. And on a human level, I recognize how it should work, but
So
we can only operate with what.
Dave and Carl, I want to thank you both. Very good discussion here, but we are at the top of the hour, so we are done. So thank you both.
Well,
Thank
I
you,
hope
too.
we can continue this conversation, Dave, and everyone else. You have my email. I am certainly here to answer any questions, to be, a conduit for anything going on at DOT that I can help with.
All right.
Thank you, Owen. At this time, let's mute our mics.